first off, I'm going to just give you the breakdown of the structure of these files here. So, of course, obviously, you can either select, or for those who don't know, you can either select or open up the project folder, and you'll see all of this already ready to go. The Retrowave Obstacle Course Game Kit is in its own object right here. So if you ever just want to drag and drop the objects into your own environment, you can just turn those off, or you can import the package into whatever space that you already have. So I want to show you real quick. So in the Mona library, you're going to find all the prefabs. So of course you can just go in here and you can utilize the ones that are already in the space itself, copy them, paste them, utilize them. But ideally, it's probably more efficient to just go into the folder structure in the Mona library kits Retrowave Obstacle Course Game Kit, and you can just tap on the folder for the individual item that you want and drag and drop it. So just to go through real quick how easy it is to just implement these items into your space, you literally just drag and drop it and they're ready to go. So an anti-gravity fan, that's going to be ready to play with. And let's see, a little cutscene gizmo. So you get the idea, just basic drag and drop. Now, I'm going to turn all of these on, and I'm going to go through setting up all of these and give you a little perspective on the colors of these boxes and things. So these highlighted areas that are transparent, light bluish transparent right here, those are actually triggers or areas where events happen. So for example, in the super jump power up, that space is the area where the super jump can happen, right? But you wouldn't, of course, you wouldn't need that. You wouldn't want that to be visible. All you have to do is just tap on the object and go into your inspector, and then find yourself the mesh render and just turn that off. So that fits there so that you know where it is and you can manipulate it, change it, move its position and whatever. Now, let me back up here a little bit. And I got a little breakdown. So let's start off with, let's just pretend that you're going to go and start putting together a game. One of the first things we're going to start off with is a start gate for this particular obstacle course game kit. And the start gate, right over here, has a beginning and an end. So you can just literally grab the start gate object from your hierarchy, put the start position wherever you want it, and then right behind it, we've got the end. And this is going to automatically work as such that when you step on the trigger in front of the gate, it's going to do a little countdown, it's going to open the gate, you can run through it, and the timer is going to start counting down. And then when you walk to the end, the timer is going to stop. So you can position that wherever you want. Now, of course, to get your space going, if you want, you can utilize these blocks. So we can just copy and paste, or we can go into the folder structure, into the blocks, and just drag and drop into our scene and start building your environment where you're going to put the interactive and animated objects. So let's say you've got all that set. You've got a space, you've got an obstacle course of sorts ready to go, you've got a beginning and an end, you've got your timer. One important thing in any game, of course, is going to be respawning capabilities. So we've got a respawn module, and I'm utilizing it. You can see in the lunge trap here, these are animated interactive objects. So animation or interactivity is not all about coding and no code interactivity, but animation also plays a big part in creating interactive elements. So you can see I'm using the respawn feature on all of these. So the floor right there is using a Mona warp, which essentially facilitates, let me get to that object. There it is, the Mona warp. So that facilitates the teleporting, which we're repurposing as a respawn. And all it basically is, if you need to utilize the Mona warp, you want to create it from scratch, you can, but the kit obviously includes this. All you have to do is go to add component and select warp, and you'll add that to whatever object you want to. And all you need to do to create the respawn is take another object, the object that you want, whose position you want the respawn to happen, and just drag it into the warp point. Now, the use rotation just basically means when the character walks into the warp object, and spawns, do you want them to spawn in the same position they were facing, or do you want to specify that it's going to point in the direction of the forward position of the object that you've selected? So, but we don't need to worry about that. It's all ready to go. And actually, let me jump into the space and show you. And while that's loading, so obviously you could see over here, I've modified the position. If you need to, all you have to do is change the size of your objects. So wherever they land on this, they're going to spawn. And if you need to move your spawn point, just move it, and that's where they're going to spawn. So that's good to go. I just want to demonstrate it real quick. Oops. What happened there? All right, so did anybody get a chance to play with this yet?
Yes.
It's nice to see you guys in here. So yeah, as you can see, if you walk over to the respawn, just to get a better perspective on how it works, you walk into the trigger object with the mono warp, and it respawns you. So if you want to test the lunge trap or the moving objects or whatever, just go ahead and step on the warp, and it'll spawn you into that particular animated hazard or trap. So that's essentially the respawn, and I use that consistently throughout the game that we created utilizing this kit as well. And again, the one unique way that I used the warp is in the lunge trap. You notice it has animated spikes that pop up and down. I basically have a little bit of a warp in there so that if you touch it, it respawns you again, and that's how we're creating that kind of gaming functionality. Now, I want to show you how all these animations basically boil down to, or these triggered events, the interactivity boils down to an on and off, right? So we're triggering an object, which then triggers an animation to play. And one very basic example of that is these achievements, or I like to call it broadly achievements. And that could be like a checkpoint, or it could be inventory. So if you look at the game or the kit, if you walk up to one of the checkpoints, all it does is it just turns on a graphic via animation. But if you can imagine that you have like a talisman that a user can collect. And let's imagine that this is actually the talisman. You can walk up to it, and then that would be the inventory area that would store it. You would have the talisman in place of where it says checkpoint. So you can use that as an inventory system, a checkpoint system, and all sorts of different things just by having the ability to touch an object, have it appear somewhere else or something like that. And using that same principle, and this is where I love the power of just even that basic interaction, is how I repurposed it to create the cutscene. So this cutscene here, the orb that you see right there is just basically a camera. It's just there as a reference point so you know where your camera's at. And the space is just another trigger that turns on the camera via animation. So if you have a scene where the character's doing a particularly high jump or something special, you can have a little cutscene camera in there.
Hey, Pixel Hustler, can I ask you a question?
Yep.
I'm just trying to open the project, and I just wanted to make sure. Does it have to be 22.3.6 F1?
Mm-hmm.
The version it's made in.
Oh, where am I? I'm in 22.3.6 F1. Yeah, that's the latest manual.
All right.
It shouldn't be a requirement. It should work anyway in an older version, but make sure
it's like 10 gigabytes size, the version. It's pretty big.
Is it opening in your space?
No, I can't download it. I need to clear my computer for that.
Are you sure you're opening the right folder? Because there's quite a few levels of folders in there.
All right, the Retrowave obstacle course game kit.
But tap into it and make sure that you're inside the. Let me look at it.
because it'd be nice to kind of follow
So
along.
yeah, so there's the sample Retrowave obstacle course. Oh yeah. Oh, I have mine packaged a little bit differently. Anyway, just make sure that you're opening the one that actually has the Unity files in there.
Yeah,
Did
that's
you
what I'm
confirm that?
opening. Yeah.
And what's the issue that you're having? It's just not opening. I mean, it's
Oh no,
already.
basically it's asking me to install the new version of Unity, but
Oh.
that version of Unity is like super large.
Oh yeah, for sure. So you're trying to import the package.
Yeah, I'm just trying to open it up.
Importing the package or opening the file? Like
Uh,
opening the Unity project or importing the package itself into an existing project?
I'm not sure I understand
Yeah,
what the differences between the
no
two
matter.
things are.
Yeah. So you
Sorry.
don't have you don't have this version installed?
No.
Okay.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's good to know. I
So
didn't
there's just like a
realize
heads
that.
up for everyone else, to clear your computer space because it requires quite a lot.
Yeah, it's huge. Well, sorry about that, man.
No worries. It's just so weird. Like Unity is like 50 gigabytes now.
Yeah, it's massive.
It's yeah,
Yes. So with the
I need to clear
basic,
some stuff. No worries.
the
Sorry.
yeah, no problem. So the basic interactivity of entering to a space, triggering an animation can be repurposed in numerous ways, and that's what we've done here. And then, for example, I showed you how the warp works for creating teleporting functionality. We also have something called the PPV player volumes. And the PPP player volumes is what basically affects gravity and the speed of the character when he runs. So if I go to the anti-gravity fan, and let me look at it in the hierarchy here. So if we go to the anti-gravity fan, you'll see a PPV. Anywhere that I'm using the player property volumes, you're going to see a PPV object in there. And that's going to contain the parameters for the player property volumes. So if you see here, I'm in the inspector for the player property volumes object, I've got override gravity checked and a gravity value. There's some walk speed you can change, the sprint speed. You can even affect the bloom and the chromatic abrasion and motion blur. So that's how I repurpose that to create a superpower effect. So when you go and use the super jump or the super run, I basically manipulate the bloom, the chromatic abrasion, and the motion blur so that you know, oh, I've got the superpower is turned on, right? So if we go back to the space, and if you've already, I got to make it so that the power ups refresh themselves. Right now, they're a one-time use. But if you see on my screen, so again, basic trigger initiates an animation. And what happened there is I triggered an animation on the superpower object itself, but I also triggered an animation to turn on the collider that causes the effect with the player property volume. So now I've got super jumps. So that's why you can see the bloom is affected, the chromatic abrasion, and the what do you call it? The motion blur. And I've got it set up right now that when you leave the object or the space for the player property volumes, it just turns off. And so that's a combination of those same similar principles, but utilizing the PPV and turning them on with animation essentially. And the super run is basically the same exact principle. I should have made a longer runway, but you get the idea. So you'll super run, and I could change the speed on there. So again, same principle. If I go to the super run right here, if I open it up, you'll see the PPV object, and you can see I've manipulated the walk speed and the sprint speed. And I've got the motion blur set up a little bit higher and also the chromatic abrasion so that you know that the player has actually initiated that particular power up. And then let me just. So over here is just basically a little gratuitous little bonus thing. It's just the random Skybox and audio switcher, which is just basically going to change the background and the audio that's playing at the time. You can step on that, jump on it, or whatever, and it'll change it each time. And by default, it should work in your space. Whenever anyone enters it, it's going to select a random Skybox and random background audio. So let me see. Yeah, we pretty much covered all those details. So just to be clear, if you want to create the superpower jump, you add it into your world or whatever, what you're going to do is the area that you want the player to actually be able to super run, you're just going to manipulate this object right here, the PPV object. So if I want that to be the area that they can have the super run effect, that's what that will be. And the super jump, it is important to consider. Let me turn that back on. So again, the mesh render is what's going to turn off the texture on and off for those objects that you don't want that visible. That's just there so that we can manipulate it. With the super jump, the only thing to consider is that make sure that it's high enough that the super jump effect, if you add bloom and such, is still initiated if they jump really high. Otherwise, they're going to jump out of it, and it's going to turn off the bloom effect and all that stuff. But yeah, this is pretty straightforward. That's it. As far as being able to just take these elements, put them into your space, and start using them, that's essentially it. There's not a whole lot more to it as far as that's concerned. Now, we're going to get into this in a minute, but I just want to show you, just to cover everything that's in this space. The Reactor interaction and visual scripting interaction is just basically an example of how to facilitate those two different types of those two different interactivity capabilities that Mona has. Does anybody have any questions or anything about this stuff? No? Makes sense?
I have a question. Hey, yeah. Where to download the files? Because I did not find them in my mail yet.
Oh, you didn't?
No.
We have them in the chat, I believe. Yeah, it's right here. Let me share it again.
I just did.
It's right there.
Thanks.
So yeah, the GitHub file to download the package. Were you going to say something, Augie? Oh, just need there is some space on my Premiere. There you
Oh,
go.
no, I'm good. I'm just liberating the space for the moment.
Oh, I'm assuming you have plenty of Unity animation experience, right? Or do you animate in Blender as well?
I tend to do like animations in Quill and then adjustments in Blender, and I do a bit of mocap stuff as well.
Yeah.
And I've got lots of traditional animation experience, like literally animating by hand.
And
so
Flash and stuff, yeah.
I haven't done too much in Unity. I've kind of like adjusted stuff in there.
Yeah.
But animations, same stuff wherever you go. The principles are the same, right?
Exactly. So we got a lot of new people here. I just want to say welcome, everybody. We just went ahead and pasted the links to the video walkthrough of all the different elements, as well as the GitHub for you to be able to download the files and everything. And don't worry if you missed anything. We'll have a video posted. And this part of it really was very straightforward. Oops. You guys are going to pick it up really quick. Really easy to implement these things into your space. So now, does anybody have any more questions before I move on?
I have a question.
Yep.
So for the visual scripting interaction, could we look at under the hood what's going on there, or how to kind of utilize that? We don't have to get too deep into like how the visual scripting is working, but maybe just so that we know if we wanted to, add that to one of our spaces.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to touch on next. I'm basically going to demonstrate to you how to create interaction with the Reactor, and also how to do the same with visual scripting. And then we'll actually see them side by side to just actually see it as far as what the experience is when you're actually in world. And one thing to consider, I would say this, as far as from a technological standpoint, from development, from making games, from making everything, it's always going to be the case, and stuff changes with technology all the time, that you're going to be adapting. And oftentimes, like as is the case with this right now, it's not so much a matter of either or. It just depends what you're trying to create. And there's going to be times where you're going to want hybrid experiences that have some elements are going to be Reactor. And that's mainly because it allows for the global events, right? So if I touch something, everyone in the space sees it. And in visual scripting, it's a little bit different right now, although that is going to evolve. But yeah, let's just get right into it and I'll show you. And this is, I would say, if you want to really anchor understanding this, it would be helpful to open up the space and actually follow along. So I've got an object here, the interaction tutorial. That should be turned off in your space by default. But if you've got it open, go ahead and go to the checkbox in the inspector to turn it on. And then if you look inside, I've got the visual scripting trigger, this object right here. And then I've got the reactor trigger right here. And then I've got my triggered object that I want to actually trigger an animation on. So for those of you that don't have animation experience with Unity, let's go ahead and touch on that. This is a really important one. So I'm going to go to Window. And if you don't have it open already, the animation in Animator, just go to Window, Animation, select the Animation tab, and then go to Window, Animation, select the Animator tab. Now, to add animation, you can just click on any object that you want to apply the animation to, go to your animation window, and you're going to click Create. I've already got a temp folder that I created that I can stick these files in temporarily, and I'm just going to do, let's say, triggered animation, and that's going to create an animation file called triggered animation that's attached to this particular object. And if you look in the inspector for that object, you're going to see the animator component right there, and that's basically our animation controller. Now, I love this about Unity. There's quite a few different ways to go about creating animation, but one of the quickest, shortest distances from point A to point B is to just go into your animation window, click the record button right here, and anything I do, you'll see it creates a keyframe to record that current position. Or if I go ahead and I rotate my object, you can see that it recorded a keyframe for that particular rotation position. So now all I have to do is move the timeline, let's say, or I can just type it in here, 30 seconds. So at 30 seconds, I'm going to just rotate my object again, and I'm going to move its position. That's it. We just created an animation. So if I go back, if I hit play, you can see the animation. So we'll leave it at that as our little test animation. But there's one more thing we need to do. So go into the animator, and basically these are called states, and you can think of them as states of animation. So you might have a close the door, open the door, things like that. But by default, it's just going to automatically play that animation. I don't want that. I want to trigger that animation. So I'm going to right click, create a new state, and I want an empty one. But I also want that to be the default state. So I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to select set as layer default state. So now basically nothing's going to happen. And that default state is going to be this right here. So if I click away from that object, click back to it, whatever state it's in right now, that's going to be the initial state. So if I move it, obviously, and change it, that's still the initial state. Now, in order to create the transition from that default state to our animation that we want to trigger, we want to create that transition by right-clicking on the default state and selecting Make Transition. And you just drag that over to the animation that we want to follow afterwards and click on it. So this little arrow here is basically representative of our transition, and I can click on it, and there's some additional parameters here. So now what we have is just basically a default state. There's no triggering capability. Nothing would happen if you play this. In order to actually trigger it with Reactor or with visual scripting, we need to create a parameter. So in the animator, we have parameters and layers. We're just going to focus on parameters right now. And I'm going to click on this little arrow here, and this gives us a few different options. It gives us a float, which is basically a number with some decimal positions, an integer, a Boolean, which is basically true or false, and a trigger. In this instance, I'm going to use a Boolean. More often than not, in most basic instances, you're going to use a true or false. So a Boolean, and I'm just going to say on for when the animation is on or off. And if we wanted to, let's say, for example, we wanted that parameter to be default to off, we would just check that box. So I'm going to leave that unchecked, and we're going to go here and click on the transition. And now if I click this little plus sign under conditions, you're going to see our parameter. So we're just basically saying we want you to transition to this animation when the parameter on is set to true. And of course, obviously, if we wanted to do another animation where we turn it off, we can set it to false and create another condition in here. So does that make sense? Is that clear? Does anybody have any questions about that? All right, just interject if you do. So now the second half of that, we have our animation, we have it set up with a parameter, we have the capability that if we turn that value on to true, it's going to play. So since this is the default position and nothing's happening, if we were now to set this parameter to on or true, now when we played it by default, it would actually immediately transition to our animation. So for demonstration purposes, I've created a reactor trigger and a visual scripting trigger option. So we're going to click on the reactor trigger object, and we're going to go to the inspector, and now we're going to add our interactivity. So we're going to click on add component, and we're going to look for the Mona reactor. Go ahead, select that, and that adds that to our trigger object. Now we have a bunch of different features here. Unenable and disable is actually not functional at the moment, but you can either select that the trigger happens when the player enters the trigger. So on enter trigger, the player enters the object that we've selected as our trigger, or there's an action that happens when the player exits that box that we've designated as the trigger. You can also set it up so that it works, as you might have seen in some of the Mona spaces, where you can look at an object in order to interact with it. So you can make it based on looking at it or looking away from it. We're going to focus solely on the on enter trigger. So to create an event to actually trigger that animation, we're going to go to the on enter trigger dropdown, and we're going to click this little plus sign right there. And now we can just give it whatever generic name we want. I'm just going to say start animation. And what we're doing in this instance is we're going to set the on parameter to true. So we're going to leave that as is. There are other options. If anybody has seen my space where I have 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons, and you can actually select them in a certain sequence in order to unlock a door, that gets into utilizing like the integers here and some of these values here, adding and subtracting to different elements and stuff. So you could get really deep into doing more complex interactivity, but we're going to focus right now on just this basic stuff. So we're going to set the on parameter, and it's a Boolean, so we need to specify that we've selected it as a Boolean, and we're going to say true. So again, that's true or false, and we're just setting it to true. So all we're doing right now is basically when someone walks into that object, we're going to set, oh, I forgot one thing. Which object are we setting that parameter on? That's kind of important. So I'm going to go to the triggered object that has the parameter, and I'm just going to drag and drop it in there. So now we're just telling it the on parameter in the triggered object, set it to true. And then let me just test that, make sure that actually worked.
And Pixel Hustler, for the parameter, it's important to have the capital O on the on there, right? Because it has to be exact same as the parameters on the lower left corner there, right?
To be honest with you, I couldn't tell you if it's case sensitive, but I assume it is, and that's the way I do it. I would say it's best practice to keep your capitalization the same across the board when you're doing general interactivity stuff, but that might not be exactly the case. I can't confirm that for certain.
Okay.
All right, so we're in our space. We enter the trigger. The animation happens. So now I'm hoping that you understand how like the basis of everything that you've seen here is just that. I was explaining, when you go to the super jump power up, all that's happening is instead of me just triggering an animation on the collider object for the player property volumes, and I'll show you that to clarify, I'm also manipulating the trigger object. So in the instance that we just created, only the triggered object is animating. But I could have just as easily said, okay, when I turn a parameter called on for the object that's actually the triggered object, I want that to animate as well. So if you could imagine, well, the power-up itself is the perfect example. So in that instance, I'm triggering two animations, one for the object that actually does the triggering of the other ones, if that makes sense. And I'll show you right here. So if I go to the super jump power-up, or the super run, whatever. If I look at the player property volumes object that I keep mentioning, if I go to the its animation, you'll see I have a PPV pad on. So it has a collider, right? So it's detecting whether or not someone is in that space. That's currently off by default. So if I look at the animator, the default state is that the collider is off. So it doesn't register when you walk into it. But when you touch the power up, I'm basically saying, so if I look at the power up, where'd it go? If I look at the reactor on the power up reactor, you can see I've got, where'd it go? There we go. So I've got 3 different events that are happening. I'm turning on the animation for the power up. I'm turning on another animation, which is the stars. And then I'm turning on the player property volumes animation, which status is true. Is the power up activity active or not? So if I look at player property volumes, go to the animation. If you look at the box collider right there, which detects if someone walked into it, when the animation is triggered, it basically turns it on. You see that? So it's only a single frame. And this is a really important note. So whereas we've been manipulating the position and the rotation of an object with animation, you can also turn things on and off. So in this instance, I'm using animation to turn on and off the collider itself. Does that make sense? Any questions about all that?
I have
Or you need me to
question.
clarify? Yeah.
Yeah, so you set a keyframe. You press the record button on the animator, and you set a keyframe to turn on and off parameters in the inspector. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, not all parameters can be manipulated with animation. But for example, if I was to remove that property, hit record, you can see collider is one of them. Also, mesh render is one of them. So if you wanted to make an object visible, invisible, enabled doesn't typically work. You can see enabled, disabled doesn't work. So if you wanted to make, so when I make the ball of the power up disappear, I'm turning off the mesh render.
The mesh render, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes.
So if anybody has any questions about that, just feel free to interject and let me know. Meanwhile, I'm going to move on to the visual scripting approach.
I've got a little cue.
Yeah.
I just going to check. So can you string these along, basically? So you can create like one set of animations followed by a trigger, and then make a little noodle-rama to basically that leads into another one set, and then leads to another set. So you basically kind of create like trees of it, right?
Yeah. So for example, let's say you can add, actually, I'll do this right here, right? So I'm just going to go to, let's just play with, I don't want to mess with that object. Let me see. So if I was to add another animation, so let's say I go to this object, which was just our little basic animation that we're playing with. I could come in here. We got our triggered animation that we created. I can click, create a new clip, and I created, let's say I create, let's just do test. Now I've created another animation. So this object now has 2 animations associated with it. If I go to the animator, you can now see my test animation is there as well. And again, this is a state machine. It controls the states of animations. So if I wanted to, I can put this wherever I want. Let's say I wanted one animation to happen when the user does a particular thing. But then I want the next animation to happen when the user does another thing. I would just basically create another transition to that animation. Does that make sense?
Super. That's exactly what I was wondering. Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. And this doesn't have to have a condition. The condition in the transition just merely allows you to create a pause between, the condition must be met before the other animation plays, basically. And, you can get crafty with it. It doesn't have to be linear. You can do things like that for different kinds of effects. Maybe you want to trigger a specific animation. One of 3 animations happen depending what the user does. Obviously, that wouldn't be linear then, because you'd want to go from the default state. And just while we're here, another important thing is, so for example, right now the power-ups are one-time use, right? If I wanted to make them usable again, what I could do is I can go to the object, let's say the power-up. Oh, that's the particles. Hold on. Okay. So this is the animation for when the user gets the power-up. Once that animation's done, it's done. The power-up reactor, let me actually turn that off so you could see it. So there's our power-up. When you trigger the animation, it just disappears. If I wanted to, I can make it so that, imagine I made an animation that's 3 seconds long. The power-up disappears, and then 3 minutes later, I can turn it back on. Or 3 minutes later, when the animation finishes, I can add a transition directly back to the default position. And after the initial animation, those 3 minutes happens, since I don't have a condition on the return, it will just automatically return. Does that make sense? So basically, I touch the power-up disappears, but it continues to play for 3 minutes. And then, because when it ends, because I don't have a condition, but I have a transition back to the original state, after 3 minutes, it'll go back to the original state and reappear again. Does that make sense? I'm going to assume that does. If not, please feel free to, I'm happy to clarify anything you guys need to know. So, again, I'm sorry?
Can I ask a question about that real quick?
Yeah, please.
So how would you possibly, when that came back, how would you attach it like a animation, like a incoming animation when it like returns? Would you have to make another one of those nodes in there and attach it as a separate transition?
Are you saying, for example, instead of it, like right now, let's say that we had an animation that when you touch it, it sparkles or something like right now I have stars, right? So that happens and then it disappears. And then you're saying an animation for it to kind of like whoop, 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 and come back?
3 minutes, it'll animate back.
Yeah. So there's quite a few different ways to go about it. The shortest distance from point A to point B is that you would make an initial state that when it first appears, you have that animation, right? And then by just the nature of, so let's assume that the default state is actually the animation you're talking about. It's the animation of it appearing. So then when the animation of it disappearing is finished, it returns back and triggers that initial animation of it appearing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there would have to be an initial animation on those Powerball, or a coin or whatever you do.
I'm saying that would be the easiest way to go about it, but you could, for example, let's say, for example, remove the transition back, and you could, if you wanted to, create another animation and transition that happens after the initial disappearance. So there's quite a few different ways to go about it. Like if you did not want to have an initial appearing animation, you would just add another animation that has the appearing effect. So for example, let's say that this is my reappear animation. I might make it that when the user leaves the area of the super jump, I want the thing to return, right? The power-up to return. So I would create another condition with a transition to the animation of it returning. So I could put a condition here. Let's say I create another parameter for a true or false parameter that has left the super area or whatever. And then I can change that condition when the user leaves the reactor object that triggers the animations. And I can set that to true. And because we would be here at this animation, it would trigger that next event. So if I go to the conditions, I can select has left the super area. Does that make sense? So you could do it linear if you wanted to, and then if you wanted to still return back to the beginning, you can just go like that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, not like the linear approach. That's
Yeah. So there's a few different ways to go about it, but the shortest distance from point A, if you don't mind having an initial animation when it appears. I mean, look, more than likely nobody would see it, right? Because if it's in your space, in your game, and the object is somewhere off in the distance, whatever. But yeah, there's quite a few ways to go about it. And if you have a particular use case that you want to know, yeah, feel free to let me know, and maybe on another chat or DMs or something, I'll help you out with that. But
thank you.
let me real quick, if anybody has any questions in that regard, hold on to that for a moment, and let me just get through the visual scripting aspect of doing the same. All right, so we've set up our Reactor trigger object. Now I'm going to set up the visual scripting trigger object. So once again, back to the inspector for the object that we want to make the trigger. We're going to go to add component, but this time instead of selecting Reactor, I'm just going to type in script, and we're going to see script machine. So this component basically makes it so that our object can be essentially a container for what's called a scripting graph. So we're going to need a script, or a scripting graph, I should say. We're going to click new, and this is similar to creating our animations. Similar, not quite, but similar. So I'm just going to say animation trigger. Now we've got our script graph attached to that object. I'm going to click on edit graph. So this is our scripting graph. And now I want to show you something real important. This will probably help shed light on how all this works. I'm just going to create, actually, let me do it over here. I'm just going to create a regular script. So new script, I'm just going to say test. Now this is the sort of traditional way of doing coding with Unity. So I've created, I don't know why it's tripping right now. Looks like it's having some issue. Let me see if I could open it. All right, I gotta let Unity do its thinking. All right, so we've got our test script right here, and I should be able to, forgot how to actually open it from here. Oh, there we go. So I'm just clicking edit script. So we've essentially added a script where we can put code to attach to that particular object. And you can see here, we don't need to get into the nitty gritty and learn any code or anything like that, but I just want to demonstrate that by default, the Unity C# script is going to include two functions, one for start and one for update. Start just happens when the space is ready to go, and update happens in kind of an interval. So if we look at the scripting graph, you can see on start and on update. So these are nodes, and these are the visual representations of that code. That's in essence what we're doing with visual scripting, is utilizing visual representations of what is in essence just code. We don't need these, so I'm just going to delete those. So in order to create that same functionality, I'm going to right click on the scripting graph area, and I'm going to type in on enter, just to find our on-trigger enter node. So there's our on-trigger enter node, and it's going to default to this, meaning apply this to this object. This object is the trigger object. And then you can think of this as sort of like electrical wires that pass electricity to other nodes. I'm going to drag that out. When I release, it opens up the search again. And first things first, I need to find that object that we want to trigger. So I'm going to do object find, and we're going to get the game object find node. And we're going to grab the name of our object, triggered object. We're just going to stick it in there. So when the player enters this particular object, let's find the triggered object that includes our animation. And then we're going to click to drag that out and select another node. And we're going to attach ourselves to the animator object. So that animator object, or component, I should say, that gets connected to our object, we want to change just the state name. The state name meaning basically the animation state. So that's the equivalent of, right here, where is it? Oops. the animator object right there. So we're basically connecting to that animator object that controls the animation. And now we got to give it the state name. So our object's animation, ooh, I goofed everything up over here. Let me clean this up real quick. Make sure our parameters going. Okay. So if I go back to our scripting graph, I just need to put in there the name of the animation we want to trigger. Triggered animation. But now, really importantly, this animator play node is still defaulting to this object. So it's thinking that we're trying to reference an animator on the trigger object. So we need to basically go to the game find object find, and we just need to drag this here to tell it, no, we want you to apply this to the animator that's on the object that we just looked for, the one that contains the animation. Now, there's one more thing that we have to do. It's a little bit slightly different since we're not calling, well, let me go back to, so in the animator, in our triggered object that includes our animation, I'm going to actually remove this Boolean true or false because we're not going to set the value true or false. We just want to be able to trigger the animation that we've already given a name. We already know what it is. So I'm just going to, doesn't matter what you call that, but I've selected trigger this time from the drop-down menu. And over here in our transition, instead of our previous condition which was when the on parameter is true, I'm going to actually just click it. And all it is just trigger. That's it. That's the condition. And the trigger is when we request that animation name. So hopefully this works. Let's just go ahead and try it. That is better work. This thing's been giving me problems today. Oh, it didn't work. All right, let me try to debug that. Let me make sure. Our object's animation is still intact. The animation trigger is correct. Triggered object, triggered animation, triggered animation. That should work. I'm not sure why that one's not working. Anyway, you'll see over here, the example that's in the kit is essentially the exact same thing. I don't know why that one's not working, but it's exactly the same thing. So I'm not going to bother troubleshooting that one right now. It's probably something relatively simple, but you can reference this. It's just basically exactly what we just created.
I think I don't hear you, Pixel, if you're speaking.
Yeah, Pixel, we can't hear you right now.
The sound to know that it shouldn't turn off anyway. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, so I'm just going to basically enter the space in two different windows. And one of my guys here is just going to be a spectator. So we're just going to look at the interaction for both Reactor and the visual scripting. And so over here, if you watch the spectator and my space, you'll see if I go to the reactor, you'll see the animation is playing in both screens. So that's a global event, that's networked. But with the visual scripting at the moment, you'll see that it only happened on my screen. So those events are local. And real important, there are instances where you're going to want local events. So for example, let's say you have a secret area that you only want the person who figured out how to unlock it to get into it. So even with the reactor, so here's the reactor trigger. If I go into the reactor in the inspector, there's an option for local. So you can make it so that a reactor event only happens for the person who's triggered it. But at the moment, you can't make it so that a visual scripting event will be global and seen by everybody else. So that's why I say that right now, but there are obviously use cases for visual scripting. All the recent games that we did for Halloween were with visual scripting. So there's some pros and cons there, but I wouldn't look at it that way as much as what is the thing that is most suitable for what you're trying to do, right? Any questions about all that?
Awesome. Just recapping. So the visual scripting allows you to make local events, and the reactor allows you to make networked events.
Network or local?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that will change over time, but that's the case right now. So if you do want to have networked global events, you're going to have to use Reactor. Now, I'm glad we actually, if you guys want to stick around, that pretty much covers the totality of what I wanted to share. I'm hoping that you guys understand how every element in this space is created with this very basic animation. That's all it is. There's nothing beyond what I just showed you going on for any one of those elements.